Okay, let's get started here. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first session of the 2020-2021 Learning Exchange Series lineup. I am your host, Lauren Cooper. I lead the Forest, Carbon, and Climate program at Michigan State University, and I'm also on the steering committee of the Forest Climate Working Group. We are very pleased to lead this year's Learning Exchange Series once again. Here's the full lineup. If you haven't had a chance to take a look, we have all sessions currently available for registration. So if you'd like to head over to our website, you can sign up for any courses and you will get a calendar invitation so that you don't forget about anything that's upcoming. For those that aren't familiar with the Forest Climate Working Group, it is a diverse group of forest interests with over 50 members, including landowners, industry actors, conservationists, academia, and those active in carbon markets. The group has worked together for more than a decade to advocate for state and federal policies that work to ensure sustainable forest use and prevention of land use change. We're going to try something a little new this time at the request of our first speakers. I'm going to put up a poll here. So I encourage you to answer the questions. They're completely anonymous, but just to get some kind of fun feedback and interactiveness here. And I'm going to introduce our speakers next. So here today, we are going to have two speakers from SCS Global Services. Christie Pollet-Young, who's the director of SCS the Greenhouse Gas Verification Program, and Alexa Dugan, the Greenhouse Gas Verification Forester. They'll give a presentation titled Ensuring the Integrity of Forest Carbon Offsets, the Role of Verification. So their session will focus on the characteristics of high quality forest carbon offsets and demonstrate which types can assist individuals, companies, and even nations in their sustainability and carbon neutrality goals. Before I get started, though, a couple of housekeeping pieces of information. If you'd like to automatically receive updates about sessions, you're welcome to email us at forestc@msu.edu to join our email list. We also handle Q&A through the chat function. So if you'd like to submit a question, feel free to submit them at any point. We actually encourage you at any point, feel free to submit a question. And we will organize them and be able to present them to our speakers at the end of the session. Another note is that the question and answer can go pretty quickly. So if we have outstanding questions, we'll follow up with our speakers and get some written responses that we'll post alongside of all of the materials. And on that note, this session is being recorded. We do post the recording and your presentation slides or the speaker's presentation slides after the event. So if you'd like to review this or share this with a colleague, the content will be available to you later on. And then the next bit, for those that are interested in continuing education credits, we do have SAF CFEs available and ISA CEUs. So if you're a member of one of these groups, you would like your time here credited. If you're affiliated with SAF, this will happen automatically. We submit the contact list to SAF. If you're interested in ISA credits, please reach out to us and we will share the event code with you. And on that note, our speakers will be handling their handoff today. And I'll be hopping back in for the Q&A. But with that, Christie is going to start us off. So will you please share your screen and begin today's presentation, Christie? Thank you.
Oops. Sorry about that, guys. There seems to be a problem. You're going to see it. Okay. All right. Thank you, Lauren, for that introduction. And I just wanted to go over the presentation. Here's an overview. We're going to ask a couple of questions. Who is SCS? Why offsets? Why do we need verification? And how does verification ensure integrity? So let's talk about that. So I'd like to start off by looking at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This is why I get up in the morning. I'd like to transform our world looking at these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm particularly thinking right now about number 3, good health and well-being, considering that we're in a global pandemic right now. And I live in the US West where I can't even breathe outside. So I'd like to promote this world and this vision. And I'm happy to say that my company, SCS Global Services, is doing just that. We are an auditing and certification company, and we're looking at all sectors of society and looking at different environmental claims, everything from organic food to non-GMO to the Forest Stewardship Council, the Marine Stewardship Council, recycled content, and furniture and flooring. So just so many ways in which we can improve our world by looking at it in a more environmental and socially sustainable way. We are a benefit corporation and have been in existence for over 35 years, and we have a network of folks around the world. So I don't think I need to tell you that climate change is a real problem. And I'd like to talk to you about why offsets could be a solution to that. It's not the only solution, surely. Unfortunately, there's not just one that's going to get us out of this situation, but it's definitely one tool in the toolkit. And by no means is it perfect. I am here to tell you, as an auditor and someone who's been on working groups and looked at methodologies, we are always looking for improvements and ways to make sure that what we are doing is something that is sustainable and is really developing a world that is beneficial for all. So I'd like to ask you, as scientists, policymakers, corporate sustainability folks, anyone in this audience, you have ways to create a dialogue where we can improve upon what we're doing. We'd love to hear it because, again, we're only as good as our last project or our last verification, and we're always looking to make sure that we're doing something to help with climate change. So just a little photo of our new normal, which I'd like to say is actually not what we would like to keep happening. And I would like to demonstrate how offsets could be a part of changing this reality. So what is an offset? Offsets are a scientifically quantified reduction in greenhouse gas emissions created when 1 metric ton of GHGs is captured, avoided, or destroyed to compensate for a metric ton emission. So that could be locally in your own area, globally, in the past, in the future. There's a lot of possibilities when we're talking about destroying emissions and sequestering carbon. So how are offsets generated? This depends on the folks that are developing and implementing a project. So I'm here to talk about different project types. This group is primarily forestry folks. So I will say for forestry, we're looking at improved forest management. So that's anything from stream side buffers, improvements, increased rotational age, looking at fuels treatment, doing management to stop lots of buildup of fuels. We're looking at REDD, so reduced deforestation, deforestation and forest degradation. So avoiding palm oil plantations, looking at departures from building roads and taking out tropical forest. So lots of these projects, in addition to sequestering or avoiding emissions, also have benefits perhaps to the watershed, to the peoples and communities there, promoting livelihoods such as sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, perhaps educational facilities or schools, or even job promotion. So projects are developed, and then folks like SES come in and verify it, make sure all the rules are met, and then people buy them. So that could be you, me, governments, companies. And I just wanted to give you a quick overview of some of the prices to kind of give you an idea. On the left are the different types of projects. As you can see, there's ways to generate offsets by all different means, because as our society has evolved, we haven't been doing it in the most efficient, environmentally and socially responsible way. So there's room for improvement. So you can see the prices, the cheapest being renewable energy at $1.4 a ton, to up to forestry, which is higher, $4.3 per ton. And this is the voluntary market. And just to put in a little bit of contrast, the cap and trade program in California, which has forestry, is about $16 a ton. These prices are from 2019. And you could see that the price actually increases with the complexity of the projects and the expertise and skills required not only to develop and implement the project, but also to verify and review the projects. Alexa later on in the presentation is going to talk about all the fancy tools and approaches that we do. So the road to decarbonization. So, we didn't have our poll results. I think that would be interesting to see. So we're measuring and reporting, oh, here it is. So it seems like there's been a lot of folks that actually looked at their carbon footprint, but various that have not. And it's great that we're doing a lot with GH energy efficiency, but maybe could do a little bit better on internal carbon pricing and all of the above. Good for you. And some offset folks. That's awesome. Thank you for that, Lauren, or mysterious person. So I wanted to talk about the road decarbonization. It's a little bit like we just discussed. It's, number one is measuring and reporting your footprint. And then developing a decarbonization or sustainability plan. So it's everything from reducing your emissions, supporting energy efficiencies, implementing policy changes, investing in new technologies to reduce energy use, research and development, setting internal price on carbon, and then purchasing offsets to reach your goals, which could be carbon neutral, carbon negative, net zero. And I think it's really important to highlight, some critics will say, oh, we have offsets, you're just paying folks to pollute. Actually, folks that do purchase offsets and do think about offsets as part of their plans are the leaders in doing all these other things, or many of these things, to approach reducing their emissions. And offsets are one component of that. So folks are actually doing much more. Okay. And then I wanted to show you some of the corporations that are purchasing offsets. These folks are leaders in doing things using offsets as a part of their plan. Google, I'd like to highlight, it has been carbon neutral since 2007, and they've erased all legacy emissions since their founding in 1998. And they plan to be carbon free in 2030. Microsoft is a leader. They have a goal to reduce its carbon footprint by 75% by 2030, and has internal carbon pricing, which has really been helpful to promote that. And they have called forest offsets the crown jewel of offsets. And then I'd also like to point out La Poste, which at the time, I haven't kept up, was the largest carbon neutral corporation in the world. And they really wanted to buy credits that were not only beneficial to forest and carbon sequestration or avoidance, but also communities and ecosystem services. Lyft carbon neutral rides. And I also just wanted to say that it's important to note that corporations are really leading the way, since governments, including the US, may not be making their commitments to such things as the Paris Agreement. And I think it's really important that there's been different goals to be net zero by 2030 or 2050. And there's even folks looking across the value chain, which is, a huge source of emissions. And New York Climate Week, just, last couple of weeks, have really looked at the inclusion of small and medium businesses, because this is a really important approach. And, Walmart, which is huge, is going to have a carbon neutral global operation by 2040. So let's see, why offsets is a component and catalyst for a circular economy. So it's circular economy. It's a systemic approach to economic development designed to benefit society, businesses, and the environment. It's based on the principles of designing out waste and pollution, keeping products, material in use, and regenerating natural systems. So also there's payment for ecosystem services, which is putting a value and price on carbon, ecosystem services like water and soil health, people and livelihoods, and of course, great animals like elephants. And then internal carbon pricing. If we don't put a value on carbon, there's no incentive necessarily for businesses to look at that as part of their bottom line. And we know some folks have started out like Microsoft with $25 a ton, but economists and others are thinking that it really should be about $150 or $200 a ton, which would really spur more innovation, which is really an opportunity, since there are so many ways to improve upon business as usual. In addition, we're looking at offsets can be a component of supporting international climate commitments. Even with all the nationally declared contributions, NDCs, with the Paris agreements, we're still going to have a 32 billion metric ton shortfall to reach a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. It's important to support nature-based solutions, the original green tech, as some people like to call. And I'd just like to point out that offsets are compatible with other climate approaches, such as the carbon tax. Okay, so more business reasons, reducing risk in terms of reputational, supply chain risk, looking at limited water, soil quality, which can lead to desertification, conflicts and migrations, refugees. Offsets can support corporate social responsibility goals, as well as helps with competitiveness with recruiting and retaining a workforce that really cares about sustainable development goals in the environment. One thing that I'd like to point out is that one company that we interviewed when we were looking at corporations, they're offsetting all of their employees' carbon footprints. That sounds pretty great, right? The average American has a carbon footprint of about 16 metric tons of carbon, which at a very generous price of $5 a ton is a whopping $80 per person per year. So to put that into context, Silicon Valley startups are spending about $2,000 per person per year on snacks and beverages. So it shows a little bit of where our priorities are right now. Other good business practices which support offsets are industry-led efforts such as CORSIA, which is the aviation industry, which is capping CO2 emissions from international aviation at 2020 levels and reducing net emissions by 50% by 2050 to 2005 levels. So there's a lot of reasons that corporations are taking a lead to support not only their reputation as an environmental leader, but also to ensure that their businesses fully operate, especially those dependent on water and land resources. So here is just an example of some of the carbon offset project types. We're primarily going to speak about those on the left, which are forestry based. And then on the right, you can see it goes from everything from agriculture and regenerative ag to other things related to landfill, energy efficiency, and things like electric vehicle charging stations. Okay, so some of the components of offsets, it depends on the flavor of the offset. So it could be the standard, the project type, but they all have these things in common. This is taken from the Climate Action Reserve. So some of the details and how it's addressed changes by the standard, but really, we really need to look at these core components, which is real, additional, permanent, verifiable, and no double counting. So we'll look at these aspects in more detail, and I'll talk particularly about why verification is so key. So I'll just give you a chance to take a look at that. Here's the standards that are out there. There are several more in development, but also methodologies related to different project types. These are all voluntary except for the California Air Resources Board, which is our cap and trade program. Okay, so why do we need verification? So, for insurance of the market integrity, to provide independence, financial incentives often create conflicts of interest, risk management, as we've looked at, to make sure that there's no problems or issues related to the projects themselves or the implementation, quality assurance. And I like to say for my mom, or maybe because she's in the audience, Alexa's mom, because these ladies are smart, informed, conscientious people, but they can't be biometricians or forest mensurationists to be able to understand that this project in Madagascar, so there's a picture of a lemur, has been fully, well implemented and designed, and that the communities have been consulted, and everything they say in their documentation is true. They can't do that. They're doing other busy, important things. So that's why folks like SCS come in to fill that important need. So how do I pick a verifier? I'd just like to point out not all verifications are equal. It really depends on the experience of the verification body. We have seen, the good, bad, and the ugly. There are a lot of projects out there, and they're not all winners. And I think that it's important for us to have an experience to understand, what is needed to make a quality project and what is needed to meet the requirements of each standard. Expertise, Alexa is going to show you some of the fancy and cool things that we do, but it's everything from looking at the statistics to the remote sensing to understanding the local laws and the languages and really understanding what is happening in the cultural context of Vermont or Madagascar or Zambia. Also, time and effort. We definitely, SCS prides itself on quality. So we want to take the time to actually see, do site reconnaissance, dig into the data, and actually go to the leakage belt. We've been told that no auditors ever walk this far. And why aren't we just measuring things close to the road? Because that's not good, a good random sample, and it's not looking at the risk of the project. Also effort, working hard and ensuring that we have the right people on the team. Annual accreditation, accountability, and oversight is important. So not only are we verifying you, we need to be verified too, because that's actually one of the failings of the clean development mechanism. There wasn't a lot of oversight, and folks accredited under that program still do not have a lot of oversight. So if you're looking at a project in 1 day versus another group doing it in 7 days, the amount of scrutiny and review is going to be unequal. And if you don't have an oversight, you might not necessarily do the top job. Also, you pick someone who makes your lawyer happy. The cap and trade program, the owner of the credits has the liability. So if there is a problem with the project, you don't want to have the liability for any of the issues in the creation. So here, I just wanted to point out SCS's bona fides and why we are allowed to be talking to you today and share your experiences. We have verified over 250 million tons. We've had our international accreditations since 2009. We have expertise in the California cap and trade and voluntary carbon markets globally. And we definitely work with a team of local experts and auditors. No verification decision has been overturned, but we will tell you that we have not verified every project. Some people have not been able to finish, or we have issued a negative statement. So here's just the map of most of our projects. We haven't updated it completely, but it's definitely a lot in the United States and in the tropics, everything from the peat forests of Indonesia to the Miombo woodlands of Zambia to the really cool and steep forests of Alaska. So I'm going to hand it over to Lexa, and she's going to answer these really important questions about verification. How do we do it? What steps are involved? Who is involved? How long does it take? What are the deliverables and what happens next?
All right, thank you, Christy. I am going to switch to my screen now. And here we go. This over. All right, so I am going to talk about some of the details and what we actually do as auditors. And so I'm first going to give kind of a broad overview of this entire verification process and also demonstrate along the way how we ensure integrity and rigor to our audits. And one thing that's important is that a project cannot move on to the next step until the step that it's on is completed. And so the first step is that the project proponent, which is our client, they complete a project design document. And so this is really just all of the descriptions, the methodology that they used, all the details about this project. And this is one of the most critical steps to the whole verification process, because it really tells us and shows us how prepared they are, and it will determine the length and the success of the verification overall. So next is we, as auditors, we submit a conflict of interest statement. And this is also very important because it demonstrates that we can provide an unbiased review of the project and that we're not benefiting financially from this project. So, whether the project gets credited or not, it does not affect us. It's important for integrity as well. So next we hold a kickoff meeting with the client, and this is really just to introduce them to the verification process and let them know what to expect. And now we get into like the meat, the thick of the actual verification. Okay, so this is where we start with a desk review. And so a desk review basically entails us getting all of the documentation from the client. So this is their project design document, their monitoring reports, any of their maps and data and shape files and calculations, and also their ownership documents and deeds and titles. And this really gives us a good sense of how prepared the client is, but it also lets us check for fatal flaws right in the beginning. So, you know, is there any problems with this project that's going to preclude us from going on site? One big fatal flaw that we've seen is, you know, that the landowner that is claiming these credits and this project actually doesn't own the land, or they might not have rights to the carbon or the timber. And so, I mean, that's a problem. And, you know, that's something that we're checking for right off the bat. Another important component of the whole audit process is findings. And so findings are what we issue to a client to basically say, you know, this is a problem. This is a nonconformity with the methodology or the standard and needs to be fixed. It's an iterative process between the verifier and the client, and we go back and forth and basically review it at every stage of the process. So like an example of a finding might be, in auditor speak, section 1.2 of the methodology requires a value of 0.5 is used for the carbon fraction. A carbon fraction of 0.47 was applied in the workbook. This is not in conformance with the methodology. So that's essentially how we're conveying these issues or areas that need to be fixed to the client. Next gets to the really fun part, which is my favorite part about auditing, is the site visit. And so this is where we verify the forest inventory. We also interview stakeholders and communities, and we check project boundaries. And this visit is really key. It allows us to clearly see what are the risks to the problem and see on the ground what's actually going on in this area. Have there been fires? Are there people cutting down trees? And I'm going to talk a bit more about this step in coming slides. But again, we then issue findings after the site visit, and we go back and forth with the client again. So next is another desk verification, and this is, if needed, it may require some additional carbon modeling. We use the forest vegetation simulator for projects in the US, as I'm sure many are familiar with. We're also, rechecking carbon calculations, anything that, may have changed in the course of the project. So this is kind of our last check. Some projects require more, some less, really depends. So once all the findings have been resolved, SCS, we approve a verification report, or we approve the project, the PD, and we write a verification report. This typically takes 2 weeks, again, depends on the project. Next, we have another level of oversight, and this is really important. So we basically get another set of auditor eyes on the project. And so we get a different auditor from SCS who has not been involved in the project at all. And they go through and they review the audit. So they're reviewing like us as auditors, but also the project and making sure that, we provided, a quality result. And we then, after this technical review, it typically takes 2 weeks. We then issue the report to our client for their review. And then the last step is that the report and the verification statement get submitted to the registry, whether it's the American Carbon Registry or VERA or the California Air Resources Board, and they conduct a last review. So again, here's one additional level of quality assurance. And so you can, really see that it's a long process, and there are many checks along the way, and all of them are critical for ensuring integrity. So one last point I'd like to make is that we as auditors, we cannot consult. So we're independent third-party verifiers. And that means, when we write findings and, explain issues and nonconformities to our clients, we can't tell them how to fix it. That would be, a breach of our position as auditors. And so again, this oversight, this further lends itself to ensuring integrity in this whole process. So now I'm going to get into some more of the details about auditing. So one important component is that, we as auditors, we cannot possibly check everything. We can't talk to every single person in every community. We can't remeasure every single tree. It would just take forever. And so as part of our process in ensuring a reasonable level of assurance in our audits is that we employ a risk-based sampling approach. And so this essentially means we design a sampling plan based on our initial review of the project. We use our expert judgment. We determine what areas are a little riskier that may require some additional attention. And then ultimately, this sampling plan is flexible. So if during the course of an audit, we found some issues in some area that, maybe we think, oh, we should probably talk to a few more people from this village, we can do that. And so it's very flexible, and it allows us the ability to increase our sample size as needed. Likewise, we always are introducing randomness into our sampling. And so when we conduct a site visit to go out and remeasure trees and conduct interviews, I'm not selecting the areas that are closest to the road to sample, or talk to the communities that are closest to the city that I'm staying in. We actually institute a random sample. This might be a simple random sample where we select a number of plots per ownership or strata, but it's critical that we do this to ensure integrity and employ this risk-based sampling design. And so now I'm going to talk about kind of how we employ this into the different components of auditing. And so one critical check, its first check, is the inventory, the actual forest inventory. And this inventory is foundational. It is, basically the clients are collecting tree measurements, which they are then using along with allometric equations to quantify carbon stocks and to model scenarios, so with the project and without the project. And based as part of our risk-based sampling approach, we employ what's known as sequential sampling, in which we randomly select a sample of plots. And these are areas where trees are measured in a project area. And we independently go out and remeasure these on site. So we're actually measuring every tree that the project proponent measured, but just in this sample of areas. And then at night, after our long days in the field, we go home and we enter all the data and we calculate the carbon stocks using the methodology that they've selected, and following their design document. We then compare our values to the client's values. And we do this using a statistical test. In this example I have up here, we're using a paired t-test. Basically, if the statistical test fails, then we know we have to increase our sample size. And so that means going back out into the field, selecting additional plots randomly, and continuing on with our sample until we can achieve enough confidence in the results. So this inventory point is very important, and there can sometimes be issues, which I'll show next. So one of these issues that we've all seen is border trees. So you're at a plot, you're in the center, and a tree might you measure it to be out of the plot, but in the inventory crew, they measured it to be in the plot, and so that can lead to a discrepancy in carbon depending on how large that tree was. And whatnot. And this is another, important reason why we're out there measuring, why we get this second check, where that oversight is critical. Another issue we might see is incorrect tree measurements. And there's one example for a project that we were auditing in Africa. This project had already been validated and verified in a previous year, and we were, verifying this monitoring period. And we're on site and realize that, all of the diameters are like way off. And then we realized that they were actually measuring the trees at root collar and not at the diameter at breast height. And so this caused a massive overaccounting of carbon, and credits actually had to be returned. And so again, it just further demonstrates why auditing in these site visits and actually going out there and measuring is really important. Another issue that we sometimes see are unreported harvests. So you get on site, you're ready to measure trees, and then there's no trees there. And that's an issue as far as carbon is concerned. And so I'm going to demonstrate one of those checks on this next slide. And so again, we're looking for disturbances and harvesting, and basically that the project proponent has reported them and correctly mapped them. And so if an area was harvested or say it burned down, it's going to impact the amount of carbon that is measured on that site. And so we always try to do this check before we go on site. And basically what this is showing is how we use aerial imagery. I'm showing the PlanetScope satellite imagery from before a project began and then after the project. And so basically we can see, what is the difference, how much area was harvested, and then compare that to what the client reported. And so in this example, we saw some, major issues. So I'll toggle back and forth. Okay, so these red areas were missed. These blue areas, they were included in the data set that was provided for us. And so, if I go back and forth, you could see, okay, there were a lot of areas that were missed, okay? And so this would be an example of, a higher risk area and something that we might say, okay, let's increase the sample size and maybe we'll do this check over the whole project area because this was significant. And so, this also highlights the rigor of the audit process that, we're not just going outside on site, we're also using all the tools we have available to us, including satellite imagery. So another check that we do is additionality, and this is really important. So this looks at, what would happen if the project did not occur. Okay, so what's the baseline scenario? What would happen business as usual in the absence of this project? Basically, the goal is that we want to make sure the project actually represents a change from the baseline. So whether it's, reducing harvesting or preventing deforestation, that deforestation, that would have actually occurred if we didn't do this project. Or the client didn't do this project. So one audit story that really highlights the importance of a rigorous check on additionality is we were auditing a project several years ago in Central America, and so the goal of this project was avoiding planned deforestation. And so their documentation talked about how there was going to be the landowner was going to convert 10,000 acres to a coffee plantation. Okay, and so the story all made sense on paper. There was this huge pine beetle outbreak in the area, and this landowner's timber business had become defunct, and he was looking for other options for how to make money. And so it was like, all right, I'll embark on this coffee enterprise. And so everything looked great on paper, but then we started looking under the hood a bit more, and we, doing reviews, and we started discovering a mounting body of evidence, that this was just false, that there was no intention or ability actually to develop a coffee plantation in this area. And then during the site visit, we worked with an in-country specialist on our team, and they helped us to conduct interviews and really tease out what was going on in the area. We heard from numerous people in the community that such a large coffee operation would just never happen, that it would be fought tooth and nail by environmental and other community groups, that there were really strict wildlife regulations that would make it difficult for this project to, really ever happen. And so the legal feasibility of this so-called additionality was really on shaky grounds. And ultimately, SCS did not issue a favorable verification opinion on the project. So, this just really shows the importance of, a rigorous audit and just, going beyond it looks good on paper. And, the carbon accounting checks out to actually what's really happening on the ground. And it also shows the importance of having, someone like an in-country specialist that people are willing to open up to and really talk to and share their concerns. So moving on, and so I kind of touched upon this as well, that there are multiple levels of oversight and checks that ensure integrity in this whole process. And so as I mentioned, there's a technical review stage. And so basically this technical review is providing oversight of the audit. And so it's looking at, have all the necessary audit activities actually taken place? Did they do all the checks that they were supposed to do? And this is done by, another auditor on our staff who has not, they're not familiar with the project at all. They get familiar real fast. It takes place in 2 weeks. And they go through and look at everything again. It's, of course, not as thorough as the, the entire previous audit process, but it's, one more level of checks. And it's important, and they can sometimes come up with additional findings. And, maybe there's something that the auditor missed. And I know we can all kind of attest to, having someone else check our work. And it's when you're intimately involved with something, maybe you miss something. We're all human. And so these levels of oversight are really, valuable to this whole process. And then there's also a registry review. And so after we submit the final report to the registry, they will go through and check it, and they make sure everything checks out. And sometimes they'll kick it back to us and say, hey, Verifier, you maybe missed this, or hey, the project proponent needs to submit this other document. And it's just, again, one more level of oversight that really ensures integrity to this whole process. And so lastly, Christie touched upon this, that, the level of expertise on an audit team is also very important to the process. So, we as auditors, we wear many different hats. All of us have a background in forestry. Some of us have other strengths, such as geography. We have statisticians. And for some projects, it's critical to have a biologist on staff because the project is claiming, biodiversity benefits. Just having a well-rounded team to conduct these audits makes all the difference. One thing that I want to mention is that, the human component of some of these projects can get really complicated. And so that's why it's important to have, a social expert or, an in-country technical expert on the staff or on the audit team, because, as we're going abroad and we're conducting interviews and talking to locals and communities, it's important to, have some knowledge about the cultural norms and, sensitivities, because we want to be able to gain trust and have, these folks feel comfortable and that they can speak to us openly and honestly about the project. So, really having the right expertise on an audit team matters when it comes to integrity. And so some concluding remarks are, a rigorous verification process is critical for ensuring that forest carbon offsets are real, that they're additional, that they're permanent, and that they're free of errors. And not all verifiers, not all verification bodies or verification engagements are equal. And, when buying or developing offsets, it's important to select a verifier that, really goes beyond the it looks good on paper. And then having, this thorough and comprehensive verification process is also important for maintaining consumer confidence, and that, it can ensure that we can ultimately, continue to use forest carbons as a tool in the fight against climate change. So, it's a really critical process, and just something I want to end with that I saw on my first site visit, my first audit in Colombia, that really resonated with me. We were conducting interviews in a community, and I saw this and basically saying that, we are all a family and our planet is our home. And, that's one of the reasons why I get up in the morning to do this job. So thank you very much. And I guess we're ready for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alexa and Christie. Really informative, touching on some great topics that we have not had the opportunity to go into this much depth into before. So really, really useful context. Thanks so much. We do have some interesting questions that have rolled in, and feel free to continue to submit if anyone in the attendees have further questions. But to start off with a kind of a frequency question here, can you just clarify how frequently does a project need to have the third-party verification, and if there's a difference between carbon market types. So between a regulatory or voluntary market, does that influence the frequency of verification?
I can take that. So yeah, we typically so we didn't really get into the specifics of validation versus verification, but before a project can, be actually verified, the actual design of the project has to be validated. And so this is when we're looking at, all the different mechanisms, how they're applying the methodology. And, this is a critical first step and can sometimes take a bit longer. Then a project can be verified, and verifying is when it is, we're looking at the carbon reductions and removals over a certain period of time. And so, for some registries, it might be a year. And so every year, there is a monitoring period. And after every monitoring period, we have to verify that those carbon or greenhouse gas emission reductions. Some can be longer, some can have multiple years in a monitoring period. I don't know, Christie, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, thank you, Alexa. I think it's a great question. It really depends on the standard. So there are little differences between programs, but some of them you can have a initial verification where you have everything on site, you have a desk review, and then you can follow up with just annual reports if there's no significant changes, like if their inventory design hasn't changed or you haven't had significant harvesting. So there's standards, but there's also ones where if you want to have credits, you need to have an on-site visit every time. And I'd like to point out that credits are only issued ex post, so after the fact. So think of wine vintages. So if we're in 2020 right now, we're only verifying up until yesterday, or usually the calendar year. So we don't do forward crediting. There are some projects or some programs that are trying to look into that to incentivize folks to get into developing a project. But in general, it's always after the fact and looking at what has happened in that time period.
Thank you so much for that. Another couple questions here I have are related to cost and value. And so one kind of clarification is you had shared, Christie, you had shared some price points before. And so there was a hope to clarify, are you showing market value or costs to develop those credits?
Oh, that's a really good question. Those are the prices for which the average price on the voluntary market, except for the last one of $16, to buy credit. So I would just like to point out that it's extremely low based on all of the effort to develop and implement a project, put together the documentation, have a verifier, and a whole registry process. So you could see what the complexity of the project, like these red projects in Indonesia, there's just a lot more time and expertise needed. So I also think that it's important. I know there's always a question about scale, so I'll just kind of throw it in there, is that the price of carbon, if it was much higher, the internal price of carbon as well as the market price was higher, we would have a lot more projects being able to participate. Smaller landowners or just smaller project areas could participate, because right now it's just not possible to put together all of the justification information and then have someone like an expert team, a specialist like SES look at it. So people like to have minimum acreages. I will always put it back on the person. What is your goal? Are you doing this to make money? Are you doing this to conserve land? Are you doing this for fuels treatment? What do you hope to gain by this? But I will say it's pretty easy to understand that a project of 1 million hectares is going to be a lot more profitable just because of the amount of credit you're going to get than a 100-acre project, which we have seen as well.
Yeah, so we are definitely getting a couple of questions about feasibility. So you touched on that. We have a few questions about minimum acreage. But to kind of circle around on the price point again, do you know if there's like an estimate available of the price breakdown, like how much goes to the cost of development and verification and registration versus what a landowner sees of that, and if you could maybe unpack a little the complexity of how long these projects last over time. So that might be, you know, upfront costs, but longer term returns. And just how do you usually characterize that?
Those are really great things to think about. I would actually say that I don't know what the breakdown is, and I would be really curious. And I think that some of your future panelists might be able to answer that, as well as folks that are researching it. I will say that people like to talk about verification being expensive and taking too long. But I will say that it's a small component of the price to actually develop the project, own the land, do these different tools, the different analyses, do a forest inventory. So it's interesting. I think it all depends on the different deals that are brokered, right? And it just depends on the size and the scale and complexity of your project. And I will say that, you know, looking at the prices of the table that I showed earlier, the complexity really increases, like renewable energy, a lot of in landfills, it's, you know, a lot of spreadsheets and accounting. So it doesn't take as much time for people to put together that much data or expertise. And that's why it's really important that when you have these projects, you make sure that you have someone that's able to review it based on the complexity or the technical needs of your project, and kind of liken it to a car. So like if you had a Toyota Camry, a solid car, you could probably take your project to, you know, Joe Mechanic down the street. But if you have a Maserati or a Tesla, you might want someone who's specializing in those cars and really have the wherewithal and skills to really look at them. So I would say that it really depends on the different project type, as well as the activities, the location. There's a lot of variables, and that's why it's such an art, and that you really, folks, where I saw someone asked about success, it's really good to work with a project developer with experience who's done this before, that can understand how to assess the feasibility, financial and legal, of your project, to make sure that you're accomplishing whatever goal you might have, which varies by different groups.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And so since this is becoming a topic area that's maybe increasingly relevant for more and more professionals are finding maybe their companies exploring what credits and offsets mean, or different landowners are starting to explore this. I know there's folks like different US states are starting to look across their public lands and suddenly have a lot of natural resource professionals having to start thinking about some types of questions like this. Do you have any kind of tips for people that would be thinking about developing a project and to making sure that they're on track to meet verification standards? Like what would you recommend to somebody that's you know, maybe existing project developers, but maybe people that are less familiar and starting out? And one other related question was, do you make any of your reports available, which could be helpful to see what's going into reports? So what are your recommendations there?
Alexa, do you want to take the first crack at it?
Yeah. Well, one thing, just, you know, as an auditor getting into the whole process that we look at from like the very beginning is eligibility and applicability. And so, you know, is this project even eligible? Can you meet these, you know, different requirements? And it really depends, you know, again, on the standard and again on the methodology. You know, all of these standards and methods are available online, and you know, they're not like crazy difficult to, you know, digest. I mean, sometimes when you get into like more of the quantification, it can get complicated, but, you know, like is my project applicable? Like, eligible? Do I, you know, some require that the land is, you know, FSC or American Tree Farm certified. And, you know, if you don't have that level of certification, then, or, you know, the timing of when you get that certification also matters. So I think really just understanding the methodology, you know, on the onset of the project is critical.
I would also add that it's really good to have someone with experience and expertise. We've seen a lot of really smart people do projects, but not necessarily know how to design it well. I liken it to doing my taxes. I think I'm a smart person, but I didn't do my taxes right, and I got audited, and it didn't work out so well. So I would say that just in general, a really good rule of thumb is to make sure that you fill out your information completely, thoroughly, and with evidence. It's as succinct as possible. If you have some calculations, show us your calculations. Make sure that we can follow your spreadsheet. Showing formulas is important. Just having something very obvious that we could follow so we could just check our box, they did that right, is really important. A lot of documentation is available online, particularly in the voluntary market, the Verified Carbon Standard and Climate Community and Biodiversity Standards. All of the documentation from the project proponent, as well as our report, is available online. That is not to say that everything is available, because there are proprietary methods to modeling or forecasting or just other analyses. So I say that it's really good to talk to folks that have done this before. If you feel confident, you can start working on your own, but I don't usually recommend, because it is very complicated to just do it on your own, unless it was a project that is much less complex, like a landfill.
Thank you so much for that. And so we are getting some really great questions here. So I'm going to have to maybe choose one that's a kind of an interesting technical question, and then we'll end with kind of a final higher level note. Somebody's asked a really important question. As this space is evolving and changing, and we're seeing, for example, states take on some bigger initiatives, what, from your perspective, would be happening if there's an offset project? This person used an example. Say there's an offset project in the state of Maine, in like California Cap and Trade. As Maine develops a carbon accounting program or greenhouse gas inventory, how do you think that's going to be handled in terms of like nesting projects in jurisdictions? Or how does that translate to the domestic US states? And to basically, they point out to like avoid a double counting situation. Do you have a sense of where that kind of conversation's going, or what that oversight, where that would come from, or who's looking into all of that?
I would love it if it was a problem that the US was just dying to declare its climate change commitments. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that, and it is kind of California is leading the way with the cap and trade program. I would love it if Maine did something. I can't necessarily imagine there'd be any double counting there unless the US at a national level had that concern. Or that commitment. I would say that it is an issue in some countries, and we're seeing a lot of efforts to look at national, regional, and then nest projects within it. So it takes a lot of agreement, and it is important to make sure there isn't double counting. Also, not double counting between the person where the project originates and then a country who buys the offset, or the corporation.
Thanks. That's those are some really good points. So as a kind of bigger question, where do you see your work growing and continuing to move? Are you, we have some questions about public lands. Obviously there's additional private sector interest. Where do you currently see some of the most immediate growth and maybe some of the biggest potential?
Alexa, do you want to
I can go. Just one thing that I've been seeing. So I'm actually the newest to the SCS team. But I have seen that there are more grouped projects happening in the US. So, these smaller landowners, it gives them an opportunity to actually, participate in these offsets. And so by grouping together with maybe nearby landowners, we're just seeing more of that. Even if you have a pretty small parcel of land, by combining with others, it can make a much bigger project. So
I'll also throw in there that I am really hopeful about corporations. I feel like they've really been leading the way. Now I feel like they're really originating projects and buying offsets, because we can't wait for the government to save us, especially some governments that don't have that as a priority. And we're just seeing a lot of corporations and international projects pick up the slack. As for public lands, I would say that it's important to do that. And there is a lot of land there, but there is a lot of policy and politics, and governments are not as agile and adaptive as corporations. So we have seen a lot of concerns and kind of backtracking when we were working on the national or subnational scale. That is, but regardless, we have seen a lot of programs, which is beyond a project, where we're looking at really integrating economic opportunities, livelihoods, agriculture, supply chains within a project to understand just how all these things are connected and do something that is more long-term and sustainable.
That's really helpful. And I really appreciate that you brought up the aggregated smaller landowners, Alexa, because there's some really exciting work happening in that space. And we have some speakers later in our series that will be touching on some examples of that. And so to kind of wrap up here, we are at the top of the hour. Just want to remind everyone that if we didn't get to your questions, we will be following up with our speakers and we'll hopefully have some responses to post with the recording of the session. We have our lineup here for the upcoming session on November 4th. So please feel free to sign up for that. We'll be taking a closer look at some major projects and project development side of things. So hope to see everyone there. And a very hearty thank you to our speakers. Thank you so much for the time you put into preparing your presentations today. It was very informative. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, have a great afternoon, everybody. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.